Here in James chapter 4, James is dealing with an issue that has been a problem amongst Christians from the very beginning of the church and certainly throughout the New Testament. And he says, where do wars and fights come from among you? So in verse number 1 here, you have a question. Let's just box that question in, because this is a common problem, always has been amongst Christians. For example, when Paul writes to the Christians in Corinth, or whether he's writing to them in Philippi, or even in the region of Galatia, they had this in common, that there were problems and fighting, and they were devouring each other, especially in Galatia. And James asked the question in the very early days of the church, where do wars and fights come from among you? And we need to ask that question as well. We need to think about that question, because very often we face the problems of wars and fights amongst us as Christians. Now, it's interesting in the first verse here that he identifies the problem as being within our members. Let's just have a look at what he says. Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? So he identifies the problem as coming from within, coming from ourselves, not something external. And he identifies something within us that is causing the very same thing outside of us, among us. So there are wars and fights, and they're among you. He says they come from desires that war in you, in your members. So wars and fights from among you, desires for pleasure that war in you. And you see this explanation from James as to the source of conflicts, relational issues amongst Christians. Actually, the problem doesn't come from outside of us, it comes from inside us, where there is also a war taking place. And the problem is that the war that takes place within us is resulting in wars and fightings among us. Now, as he continues, and we'll just look at structure here before we get into the details, that war in our members is what is spoken of here down in verse 2 and verse number 3, because he speaks again about fights and wars, and he's going to show a progression, and he will identify two things. So there are desires here in verse number 1, and they are for pleasure. And these desires for pleasure are causing the war. Now he says in verse 2, you lust. Now we'll link that up to desires. And then he says in verse number 3 that you may spend it on your pleasures. So we'll link that up there to pleasures. So there is a connection here between the desires for pleasure and the lust that ultimately is self-centered, so that we may spend it on our own pleasures. So let's just look at verse number 1 in a bit more detail. And this question that is posed in the beginning of the verse, where do wars and fights come from among you? Now, there are two things that he wants to identify in relation to their source, and that these are wars and fights. Now, wars would be the long conflict. World War I, World War II, the idea. And then you get fights. These are the shorter battles that make up the war. So you have lots of these that lead to and form one of those. So many battles, many fights in a big long war. Now you can identify that in a relationship. You can have a long running, let's just put something up here. You can have a long running war with someone. And then you can have occasional outbursts of conflict with that person. So it's a long-running feud, long-running battles, long-running war, and then occasionally it'll explode into outbursts of out-and-out conflict. Now, it's very sad that that should characterise Christians in their relationships with each other, but it does. And it always has done, and that's why even in the early days of the church, James poses this question: where do such wars, these long-running conflicts, and those fights, those occasional outbursts of conflict, where do they come from? Well, as we saw a few minutes ago, they come from, as he says here in the second part of the verse, again by posing a question, do they not come from your desires for pleasure that war in your members? So here's the source: desires for pleasure. There are strong urges, strong desires, lusts, and they are for pleasure, self-indulgence, self-satisfaction. That can be sexual, but it can also be things to do with pride, to do with status, to do with wealth, to do with perceived achievements in life. And he says the strong desires for pleasure actually create war. And that war is internal. So you've got an internal conflict going on within the Christian. And the internal war is caused by strong desires for pleasure. Those strong desires from pleasure find their home in the flesh that every single Christian has. And there's a conflict within a Christian between the spirit and the flesh. Paul writes to the Galatians, and you can follow this up, and speaks about the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. So you've got the works of the flesh and the fruit of the Spirit. So James is saying here that the answer to the first question lies within the second one. So you get two questions. The second question is answering the first one. Where do these wars and fights come from? The answer is they come from within. There's a conflict going on within us. There are strong desires for pleasure, for self-pleasure, for self-satisfaction, for whatever satisfies the flesh. And the strong urges that come out of the flesh produce the works of the flesh. And when you read of them in Galatians, you discover none of them are good. All of them are sinful, and all of them are very different to what the Holy Spirit wants to produce within our lives. Now he's going to speak in verse 2 and 3 about the progression and the character of that war, what actually takes place within an individual. Well, first of all, we have our word here, lust. He's the strong desire. And this lust is strong, but it's not satisfied. And because of that, it leads to this: you murder and you covet. And then the progression is you cannot obtain. Therefore, you fight and war, yet you do not have, because you do not ask. You ask and you don't receive, because you ask amiss. And the asking amiss is because you're asking for all the wrong reasons. You're asking God to satisfy your lusts, that you might spend it on your own pleasures. So you've got lust, strong desires for pleasures, linked again, as we saw earlier. So here's what happens within the life of an individual. Strong desires, unsatisfied, and that's the key in these verses. You murder and covet, you cannot obtain. You fight and war, you do not have, because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive. So it's unsatisfied lust and strong desire. And because of that unsatisfied lust and strong desire, there's conflict. And that conflict leads to conflict amongst the Christians. You might say, well, how does that happen? Well, I'll just put a little note here down at the bottom. So you've got a person and they've got strong desires. And these are unsatisfied. So then they become violent, unsatisfied. Then what happens is just this, that the violence leads to war. God is excluded, unsatisfied. So we go on. Then God is included for all the wrong reasons, unsatisfied. You have frustration, which leads to conflict with others for all sorts of reasons. It could be that there's a jealous spirit. It could be that you are not able to control these strong desires. It could be that they're producing the works of the flesh that's destructive and sinful and that impacts relationships. What he's saying is just this. If you are involved, and I'll put it up at the top here, if you're involved in conflict in a relationship, either a long war or a short battle, then NB, note well, you must first of all take a look inside for the cause. We're so quick to look for other reasons, for other causes, the blame game. Someone else is at fault, someone else has done this, someone else has done that. Actually, James says, the first person to look to if you're involved in wars or conflicts is yourself. And the place that you look is not in the externals of your life, but right down deep at the war or conflict that could be going on within you, that's spilling out and causing conflict amongst you. James chapter 4 verses 1 down to verse number 3 answers the question. And he's not finished, because in verse 4 down he's going to speak about also the impact of the environment and your affection and love for that environment also causing conflict amongst you. That's perhaps a study for another day.